The story that's really driving the day today is the sentencing at 10 a.m. of Lucy Letby, the nurse who last week became officially the worst child serial killer in British history. And it's reignited this row that we've had several times before about killers being forced into the dock to listen not only to their sentencing, and the judge sums up what they've done, which is a hell of a moment for anybody to have to face, but also the victim impact statements that are written by friends, relatives, or their victims themselves, people, perhaps the relatives of those they've killed. Something which was brought in order to give those victims sort of a better sense of justice, but which the criminals are increasingly finding ways to avoid having to listen to. Now, John, the government's been saying for a while it's going to make this mandatory. So has it?
No, it hasn't. And we keep getting this every few months. We get a high profile case. You know, we had Olivia Pratt-Corbell, that poor girl who was killed, murdered in Liverpool. We had Sabina Nessa, who was the teacher who was killed in a park not that far from here, actually. Both of them, their killers, didn't appear for sentencing. They weren't in the dock to hear the impact that it had on their victims' families. And the government has been saying for a while that it is looking at this, it is keen to do something. The latest it's saying this weekend is saying that the King's speech will be in November. That's when the government sets out a list of things it's hoping to do in the next year or so. They say when it sets out that list, it will put this law on there to do something about it. But they've still not really said how exactly are they going to deal with this problem, because there's different ideas out there. Could you say if someone doesn't turn up to their sentencing hearing that they get some years added on to their sentence? Although if you've got someone who is kind of convicted in awful murder, or someone like Lucy Letby who's found guilty of several murders, she's going to have a very long sentence, whatever it is, whether it's a whole life term or not. And so saying if you don't turn up to the dock, you can get 6 months added onto your sentence, isn't going to make much of a difference. Could you drag people into the courtroom, get the kind of prison guards in there, drag them in there? Some people said, well, if you did that, they could be kicking and screaming. That wouldn't be appropriate. Would they just scream through the whole of the sentencing and kind of make things even more chaotic and awful for the victims' families? Or could you see another idea? One of the ideas put out there the weekend by Robert Buckland, who used to be the Justice Secretary. He said that you could get a kind of audio link. So if the person sentence refuses to come up from their cell into the courtroom, that they just get the sound of the judge giving that sentencing, the sound of the victim's impact statements just being pumped into their cell, so they don't have any choice but to listen to it.
Yeah, that seems a different way of trying it. Now, there's been several comments going on Facebook. Gary says, as a parent myself, she should be forced to appear. John says perhaps offering some convicted people some form of concession if they agree to stand in court and offer an apology, a bit like making a guilty plea. It can help. But then again, you've got, I mean, Mike says here, this law is going to have to be changed, but you can imagine some who are forced into the dock for sentencing will cause mayhem. Steve Lumby was just saying that perhaps they should get, the maximum sentence if they don't have a no-show. But the thing that always sort of, the kind of stories that cause this kind of ruckus every time are the serious ones. It's the murders, isn't it? They're already getting life. So knocking 6 months off Lucy Letby's sentence is going to make no difference because she's facing multiple life sentences. The killer of Olivia Pratt-Corbell is only facing 1 life sentence, but you can knock 6 months off it. But I mean, he's still doing 20 years. Is it going to really make much difference to him? Possibly not. They were already getting the maximum term in many cases. And they're setting these tariffs and so on. And there's the possibility, of course, that if you have to physically drag someone into the court, you have to restrain them, that causes other problems. And, you know, the idea is one of those things, isn't it, that when the newspapers report on, and I'm going to say all the media are involved in this really, but when we report on a massive killing and a big case and the perpetrator doesn't want to be in the dock to face up to it effectively, the media tend to lead this call going, they must be made to do it. But the possible downsides are immense, because if someone, you know, had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the court, then they would just disrupt the courts. They would cause more suffering to the families who are there. They wouldn't get to read their impact statements out. You can't have the court being completely disrupted. I mean, if someone kicked and screamed in the dock in the middle of a court case, the judge would chuck them out until they've calmed down. So I don't think it's a practical idea. I think it's an emotional idea. really, that people really want this and they haven't perhaps thought it all the way through. And do you think the media are partly due for fueling all that?
Well, I think that this is mostly being led by families of people who have been killed, who've gone through these awful crimes, and they're never going to get their relatives back. But part of the process of this grief is finding some sort of justice. And at the moment, they feel that they're being mocked and ridiculed, really, by their loved ones' killers, who seem to have found this loophole that they're able to get out of attending the sentencing. There seems to be a trend that it keeps on happening. And I think that, yeah, it is going to be tricky to work out how exactly does the government deal with this. But I think they do have to do something, because I don't think it is acceptable that things carry on at the moment. And as you say, it is really hard to work out what exactly do you do. None of the possible solutions are exactly perfect, but I don't think it is going to be possible for the government to carry on as it is at the moment. I think you are going to have to see some sort of changes, and maybe they won't work out perfectly, but I do think you have to have some attempt, because the whole point of the justice system is not just that justice has been done, but it's being seen to be done. And at the moment, I just think it's really unsatisfactory for those poor victims, and it's just making the awful killings of their loved ones even worse.
Yeah. And what do you think, everybody? Should people be forced into the dock to actually face the consequences, not only of their actions, but to hear the impact that they've had on other people? And what happens if that in itself has, you know, not a beneficial impact, perhaps on the relatives or the victims or the court or even the killer themselves? You know, we need to dig into this a little bit. I mean, the judge in Lucy Letby's case has said, there is nothing I can do to make her and compel her come to court. But a government source has told the Telegraph today that she should be present, and there is lawful enforcement already in place. So someone who's done something important, if you want them to come to court, the judge can't compel them, but the judge can say they should be in court. And then it's up to the prison governor to decide whether or not to use force as a last resort. But by doing that, you're exposing prison officers to the risk of injury. Right, that's going to be a bit more likely. You've disrupted the court, which is going to make you have to hear those impact statements. And you've maybe even hardened the killer's mind to this process that we would all want them to go through of accepting what they did. So, you know, that may not always necessarily be beneficial. And some of the reasons, I mean, Lucy Letby, I mean, you can argue, can't you? And lots of people are going to and have said it, that people who kill, especially children, and especially at this kind of frequency, are just plain evil and they deserve no sympathy whatsoever. But somewhere inside Lucy Letby is probably a normal human being who doesn't want to face up to this, because the bit of her that's a killer has done something awful. And she's had issues during the court case. She's had to have breaks and things like this. Whether that's her being controlling and manipulative, we don't really know. But if a killer is compelled to come to the dock when they don't want to, and they don't want to face up to this, and then perhaps because of some of all the pressures they're under, they later commit suicide, they later take their own lives in jail, the victims' families feel cheated again, don't they? Because they feel in those situations, the relatives always feel that someone has escaped justice, that they've somehow got out of it. I mean, Steve says dragging someone to court is inhumane. It's not a very nice thing. Deborah says, why should they have the luxury of choosing? Well, their victims haven't had the luxury of choice, have they? But then again, if the killer commits suicide as a result of the kind of pressure that this move might put them under, how does that help the victims? How does it help justice in the long run? It doesn't, does it?
No, but I think we have to be slightly careful. I think suggesting that just that you made someone, a killer, go to their sentence hearing, that may cause them to take their own life. I think that might be a bit of a leap. And I think particularly in the case of someone like Lucy Letby, where is the evidence that if she was forced to go to her sentencing today, that she would disrupt it, that she'd be kicking and screaming? This is someone who, despite being absolutely evil and doing awful, awful things to the children who were in her care, I don't see there's any evidence that she would suddenly start lashing out at prison guards. And we know that as part of the prison system, we do make prisoners do things that they don't want to. That's the whole thing. They are there, you know, they are forced to be there as part of the prison routine. They are forced to do things. That's the whole point. It isn't meant to be this luxury where it's all about their choice. It's about being forced to do things against their will. And I think that, yeah, there might be some extreme cases where you do have it completely disrupted by screaming and shouting and lashing out. But I think actually in a lot of cases, and particularly ones with people like Lucy Letby, I'm just not sure there's the evidence that would be the case if you did force them into the courtroom.
No, there aren't going to be many cases where you've got to strap them up like Hannibal Lecter to sit there and listen quietly. But one of the things that you do need when you have someone who's committed these kind of crimes is to be able to talk to them after their sentencing and find out why they did it, how they did it, if they did it to anybody else, where the bodies are buried, that kind of thing. You need cooperation from that prisoner in the long term for not just the prison psychiatrists, but for the sake of the prison officers as well, who have to deal with them for the next 40 years. And if you start that relationship with this kind of, you've got to be dragged into court, perhaps that's not necessarily beneficial. But what do you think, everybody? Are you convinced by any of these arguments? Do you think that they just go to court and that's that? Or do you, I mean, I'm not totally against the idea of, like you were suggesting there, John, or that one of the ministers has suggested, of having the sentencing sort of played into a cell, that they have to listen to it. But then again, if someone wanted to game the system, a killer could just get a psychiatrist to say they can't do this, or they'll commit suicide, and they can't do it, and it will get turned off, wouldn't they? They do have rights as prisoners, and there would be a way. There's always a loophole. So even if they legislated for it, they'd still find a way around it, wouldn't they?
Possibly, but as I say, I think they have to do something that I just don't think things can carry on. That there has to be something that they give a go, even if it doesn't work out exactly perfectly. I think that they need to start kind of pursuing some of these ideas and see which ones work. Yeah.
Now, Hugh on Twitter says, if there's a way of forcing prisoners to attend sentencing and not let them disrupt proceedings and protest, then I'm all for it. I think it's that if that's the problem. How could it possibly be sort of done? But there is another issue here with Letby's case, which is building, which is that there are claims in today's papers that police have identified another 30 babies who suffered suspicious incidents while Letby was on duty but survived. And it's not clear if they are ever going to be investigated. It took 2 years to investigate the murders. So doing another 30 suspicious incidents is going to be a huge amount of police resource. And there's also calls for the NHS managers who passed over various chances to stop her murder spree, and in fact forced the consultants who were raising concerns to actually apologise to her when she started a grievance procedure. And whether they should face action by themselves as well. So there's this massive row brewing now over the public inquiry that's been ordered, isn't there, John, which may or may not be able to address some of these things. What's the problem with the public inquiry?
Yeah, so on Friday, after we had the sentencing and it was announced that Lucy Letby had been found guilty of all these murders and became one of the most prolific child killers in our country's history, the government said in response to that, it was going to set up an independent inquiry. And what some of the people are saying that is, rather than having an independent inquiry, it should be a public inquiry. And you might think, well, what's the difference between those? These are basically the same words, but if it is independent inquiry, you can ask people to come and testify and give evidence, and they can just, it's up to them whether they turn up or not. That is the situation that it looks like we're going to have. But if you had a public inquiry, then people would have a statutory duty, a legal duty that they had to turn up. And one of the big problems in this case is you've got NHS managers, the leaders of that hospital in Chester, and questions about why didn't they take action when these first concerns were raised by doctors in the department where she was working. We know that the consultants had worked out that the person on shift for all of these deaths had been Lucy Letby. They'd raised concerns about it, but the hospital had been really resistant to do anything. They hadn't taken it to the police. They took ages before they finally went and took it to the police. And so there'll be big questions for those hospital managers. A lot of them have now retired, moved on, left their jobs. And the problem is, if you've got an independent inquiry where it's up to them whether they bother turning up or not to answer these questions, they might think, well, hang on a minute, I'm not going to do that. And if I do turn up, is there a risk that I say something that could lead to me kind of facing a corporate manslaughter charge or something along those lines? Whereas if you have it as a public inquiry, they wouldn't have that choice. They would just have to turn up and answer these questions about why things were not done to address this when the concerns were first raised by the consultants working in a department.
Exactly. And Mike says it's almost as big a scandal as the murders themselves is the way that NHS administrators work to protect the reputation of the hospital rather than stop someone dangerous on their wards. The thing that really stood out to me when I was reading some of the background about how the managers are sort of treated some of these complaints or the issues that were being raised was just the institutionalism. And I think we've probably seen the same in multiple scandals that we could all name, where when the organisation is accused that someone within it has done something wrong, that it just it closes ranks and says, well, it's not us, we're the good guys, so you're the one causing trouble. Whether it's pointing out to the Ministry of Defence that they may have irradiated some soldiers at some point in the past, whether it's telling Rupert Murdoch's organisation that perhaps there was some phone hacking going on, whether it was anything else to do with Hillsborough or Grenfell or multiple scandals. It just seems to be that when someone raises the alarm too often, everyone just goes, well, it's not us, we're the guys in white hats. So just raising the issue is the problem. And that's the thing we need to address, rather than whether or not we need to look at it. And that there is talk about a Hillsborough law, isn't there, which Labour wants to bring in. It's supposed to be in their manifesto if they ever get around to publishing it, so if they come into government, which would produce a duty of candour on public officials, which would mean that they have to tell the truth at all times in their jobs, and give people representation and so on. If there is another sort of massive tragedy or scandal, the families of Lucy Letby's victims, suspected or otherwise, would all have someone who could represent them without having to go to fight their own legal cases and things like that. Is this current government going to have, all busy talking about public inquiries and forcing people into the dock and stuff, but in terms of tackling that institutional inability to address your own failings, which is what we all want a government to be able to do, is there any sniff of them stealing that particular idea from Labour and putting it in their own manifesto?
No, we know in this particular case that the issue was that the hospital managers weren't thinking, well, what on earth is behind these awful, mysterious deaths that are suddenly happening? Rather than getting to the bottom of that, they thought, well, if we get the police involved, and there's literally, this is written down in emails that have come out over the weekend, they were saying, well, if we get the police involved, there'll be blue and white tape everywhere. It'll be not a good thing for the hospital. It would be a really bad thing to happen. And we know that far from actually taking action, bringing the police in, what those hospital managers did in this case was that, as you mentioned in that article today, they got 7 of the doctors to sign a letter to Lucy Letby apologising that the finger of blame had been pointed to her. And 2 of the consultants in the case who had kind of put the dots together and thought that there was something suspicious here, that there was something, a link with Lucy Letby, they were told that they had to do face-to-face mediation with Lucy Letby and say, we're really sorry that the finger of blame has been pointed towards you. So rather than dealing with this problem, finding out the real answers and finding justice, the kind of automatic response had been keep things hush-hush, carry on and pretend nothing's really happening.
Yeah, and yet the process of unpicking perhaps what went wrong within the structures of the hospital, what went wrong in Lucy Letby's head, even while she's in those mediation sessions, and the doctors who had rumbled her were being forced to apologise, and what she was getting out of that, whatever control, manipulation she was exerting upon them through her grievance procedure, all that stuff. You've got to find out what went wrong in order to prevent it ever happening again. That does involve cooperation, not just of the NHS managers, of course, or perhaps compelling them to a public inquiry with statutory powers, but also getting the killer herself to sit down and start talking to people, which maybe doesn't happen if they're dragged to court. Who knows? Everything will come out in the wash, I expect. But if we see a law about this before the next general election, I'll be amazed. I don't think this government is one that's necessarily legislating very quickly for everything, unless it's to do with a boat.